Okay, we're going to go through the manual muscle exam, also referred to as the manual muscle test. So this is a test that you can use to determine the strength of muscles. As recreational therapists, you're going to be able to conduct a very basic muscle strength test, again, just on some very basic muscle groups. Now, the manual muscle exam consists of 5 levels. We have 5, which is normal, 4 is good, 3 is fair, 2 is poor, 1 is trace, and 0, of course, is 0. And we're going to start out by explaining what are the differences among these different levels by illustrating the testing of the deltoid muscle. So the first thing you would ask the individual is to put their limb into the correct position.
Can you put your limb into the correct position?
No.
Okay, so he obviously says that he could not get his limb into that correct position. So the next thing that the therapist would do was to palpitate the muscle to see if that muscle is indeed contracting. However, that is not within the scope of recreational therapy practice. So that would be something that the physical therapist would do. If there was contractibility, then that would be a level 1. The therapist is now going to provide a little bit of support to that muscle just to decrease the pull of gravity and to see if he can get his limb into that correct position with just the gravity eliminated. Great. Since he can do that, she'll then sort of lessen that gravity, and you'll notice that his arm will probably start to begin to fall back down again because the gravity is then taking hold. So if he was able to get his limb into that position with the gravity eliminated, that would be a 2 or poor. Now, if she asks him to put his limb in the position and he's able to get his limb into the correct position without any physical assistance, put your limb up there. Great. Then the next thing, we know that he can already get it into that position with gravity eliminated. So we know that it's already a 2. Now we're going to see if, and we also know that he can get his limb up there with gravity. So we know that it's definitely a 3. Now, since we know it's definitely a 3 at least, we're going to provide a little bit of resistance to see if the muscle can hold that level of resistance. So notice she has her arm on the top of his shoulder. Her other hand is slightly above his elbow. And she's going to tell him that she's going to push down with her hand that's right above the elbow and for him to resist it, to not let her push his arm down.
Yeah, I'm going to push down and we'll try to resist it.
Good. Now notice that the muscle breaks a little bit. So that means that it's a 4, which is some resistance. Now, if she did the same thing again though, and she put a full resistance onto that muscle and the muscle did not break, that would be a 5. All right, now we're going to go through all of the different muscles that you could test. So the first one that you just learned how to test was the deltoid. Okay, the next one you're going to learn is how to test the biceps. So you're going to ask him to put his hand in front with his hand facing up. The therapist is going to put her right arm underneath his elbow and her other hand in top, right above the wrist. She's then going to tell him that she's going to push down with her left hand and he's to resist.
Okay, I'm going to push down with my left hand and you have to try to resist.
Good. Notice that that was full resistance, so that would be a 5. All right, the next thing you're going to test are wrist extensors. So he's going to have his hand in front. Notice his palm is up. The therapist is going to place her hand on top of his hand and the other hand is not under the wrist, it's slightly above the wrist because you want the wrist to be able to have the motion to bend. And she's going to push down on her right hand and tell him to resist her when she provides the pressure.
Okay, try to resist the pressure.
Okay, good. So notice that was a 4, some resistance. All right, the next one she's going to do is to test intrinsic muscles of the forearm. So she's going to put her hand out and tell him to grab hold of her hand as if he's shaking her hand.
Okay, so grab hold of my hand like you're going to shake it.
Now the therapist is not holding on to his hand. The therapist is simply putting her hand straight out forward. She's then going to tell him to squeeze her hand as hard as he can and not let go. The therapist is then going to try to pull her hand out away from his hand.
Okay, so you're going to try to squeeze and then try to hold on. Try to pull on.
Okay, good. So that's full resistance. All right, the next thing she's going to test are quadriceps. So she's going to squat down at the testing side. She's going to ask him to raise his leg forward. When he lifts his leg forward, he's not to lock his knee. And you might need to ask the person to scooch a little bit further on the chair because you're going to need to put your hand above where the knee bends. So one hand goes above where the knee bends. The other hand goes on top, right above the ankle. And the therapist is going to push down with her left hand, the hand that's above his ankle. And she's going to say, I'm going to push down. Don't let me push down.
Okay, I'm going to push down. Don't let me push down.
Okay, good. Notice that his leg moved. Now let's take a closer look at that again. Can you lift his foot up? So we know he can do that against gravity. So we know that against gravity only, he's definitely a 3. As soon as she provides pressure, if it goes all the way down, then we know that it's not a 4 because a 4 would be some resistance. So that would be a 3. The next thing we're going to test are ankle dorsiflexors. You're going to have the patient put his leg out forward. You're going to ask him to raise his toes up to the ceiling. The therapist is going to put one hand flat on top of the foot. She'll probably do better to move her hands in the other way. Use her other hand underneath, there you go, and the other hand on top. It'll make it a lot easier for you. And then the therapist is going to provide pressure to the top of the foot. She's going to tell the patient not to let her bend his foot down.
Don't bend your foot down.
Good, so that's full resistance.